But over the next 2 hours, the first hour really will be on Israel-Gaza, given the current circumstances. And then we're hoping to look at Ukraine, China, the Balkans, hostage-taking, and at the end, what we like to call a quiz around the world, where we'll take you to as many countries as we can in as little time as possible. So I hope that will work for you both.
Fine.
Brilliant. Fabulous. In which case, Foreign Secretary, it'd be very helpful if you could share with us your vision for your time as Foreign Secretary and what legacy you're hoping to achieve.
Well, what I want to do is to try and help Britain maximise its security and prosperity in a very dangerous, difficult and uncertain world. I mean, when I compare the world we live in today with the one I left university into, where, you know, the Berlin Wall was falling and Russia was becoming a friend and democracy was spreading and China was joining the WTO and looked like democracy and free market economics were spreading across the world. It's completely different today. I mean, everything seems to be heading in a more dangerous direction. Russia's started a war in Europe. China is incredibly aggressive. Democracy seems to be on the back foot. Everywhere around the world you see a growth of protectionism. And of course, the threat picture, the conflict picture, whether we look at Africa, whether we look at Europe, whether we look at the Balkans, is extremely disturbing. So in those circumstances, I think trying to make sure that our foreign, security, Commonwealth, development policy is all about trying to enhance Britain's security and trying to maximise where we can our prosperity and opportunity. That is the approach I want to take.
Thank you. And tell us, your appointment was lauded largely as the biggest political shock of the last year. What made you accept the role? Was it unfinished business?
No, it was just the chance to serve. I believe very profoundly in public service. I didn't expect to be called back to this role. I went to see the Prime Minister on I think it was a Monday or a Tuesday night, and we were talking about various problems, including Israel-Gaza, and then he suddenly said, well, I'm going to be having a reshuffle and I'd like you to be my Foreign Secretary. And that was quite a shock. And I said I instantly would like to say yes, because I enjoy public service. I believe in it. It's a very difficult time for these affairs, and I hope I can make a difference. But let me go away and think about it. And I had a little bit of time to think about it and said yes, and I'm delighted to be back.
Did the Prime Minister give you an idea of why he felt there was a change in direction or leadership needed? So, you know, how will you be different from your predecessor? Because we've had lots of foreign policy by slogan, you know, Global Britain, Tilt the Indo-Pacific. What's different in your approach to your predecessors?
I think what the Prime Minister said was pretty much what I've just said to you, that it's a very unstable, uncertain, dangerous world. We've got a range of, obviously this huge conflict of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. We've got the situation in the Middle East. We've got a range of other dangers and difficulties almost everywhere you look. And I think he said, opportunity for someone who's served as Prime Minister to come back and help with these things, that you bring a certain amount, hopefully, of sort of knowledge and contacts and abilities to this role. And so you'll be able to help have what he wants to be the strongest possible government. I would pay huge tribute to my predecessor, James Cleverly, everywhere I've already visited, I think about 15 countries. Everywhere I go, he is praised for his diplomatic skills, for the hard work and energy he brought to the role. And it's great to be working with him as Home Secretary, because actually one of the priorities, I've got the 5 priorities I've set out for the department, one of them is very much about Britain's security and working with him on issues of immigration. I think too much in the past, and I blame my own government for this, the Foreign Office is going in one direction and the Home Office is going in another, and really trying to get them to work together on things like stopping migration upstream and helping stabilise countries and using all the tools you've got in the toolbox.
Forgive me, you won't be interested in a new slogan under your tenure?
I haven't come up with one yet, but maybe you could help me out. No, I mean, I've set out for the department priorities basically saying, number 1 is supporting Ukraine, number 2 is more stable Middle East, 3 is enhancing UK security, 4 is international development and the critical global challenges like the multilateral development banks, and maybe we can talk about that, and 5th is prosperity and jobs. I mean, obviously, trade isn't in the Foreign Office in the way that it used to be, but I want to help the Department of Trade deliver these important trade deals. I want to help colleagues to get inward investment into the UK and all the rest of it. So that's the focus. It's very straightforward and down to earth.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Foreign Secretary, it's interesting that you were as shocked as we were to become Foreign Secretary, but welcome. When you were Prime Minister, you created the commitment to 0.7% of GDP for overseas development aid, and you also vocally opposed the FCDO-DFID merger, or the FCO-DFID merger. What's your position now?
I didn't create the commitment, I delivered the commitment. It was a commitment that actually every country in the G8 made, I think at Gleneagles when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and I was very proud to be the first of those G8 countries to achieve 0.7, which we did, I think, in 2013. And I supported and backed DFID with, I think, a really excellent development minister, Andrew Mitchell, who I'm now working with once again. Look, and I said at the time I was disappointed when we went away from 0.7 and also about the merger, but I said to the Prime Minister when he asked me to do this job that I would accept fully cabinet collective responsibility, and I will work with what we have now and try to make sure we have the best possible joined up policy of diplomacy and aid, and try and make sure we make the very most of the 0.5% that we have. Politics is a team enterprise. You can't always get everything you want. You have to work out whether you can accept the situation and whether you can accept that cabinet collective responsibility. I can. I'll defend what we're doing now to make the FCDO work effectively, and I'll defend the fact that at 0.5% it's not as much as it was, but we're still an aid superpower. We've got this excellent development white paper, and we must use that to fulfill our moral mission in the world, but also to make sure our aid policy works for our own security and prosperity.
Will you be pushing to go back to 0.7% as quickly as possible?
Obviously, the conversations I have with cabinet colleagues are private, and that's part of the team enterprise.
I'm not sure they're that private.
Anything you want to change about how the FCDO operates at the moment?
I think that something that happened just before I got there I want it to bed in, see how it's working, which is Andrew Mitchell was appointed Development Minister. I think it was an excellent move. I was worried before that while I could see a case for how the merger would work, I was a bit worried before that there were too many international gatherings on, for instance, Global Alliance on vaccines or Global Fund on AIDS and malaria and the rest of it, where I was worried Britain wasn't fully represented every time. And I think having a dedicated development minister in the cabinet, I think that's really helped. And something we've done inside the department, which Sir Philip I want to talk about, which is having two permanent secretaries, one for foreign and diplomatic affairs and Commonwealth affairs, one specifically for development. I think that's helped, and making sure that some of the key directorates within the Foreign Office report to that second permanent secretary and are working very specifically with Minister Mitchell. I think we're making the merger work better than it was. So I'd like that to take a bit of time, see how that's bedding down, see how that's working, and try and make the most of it that way.
I think from our perspective, it would be very welcome to see some political will behind the merger. That's been our biggest criticism.
Say again?
To see the political will to make the merger work,
yes.
And not just leaving it to civil servants. From our perspective,
definitely. I think yes, we're trying to make it work. It's not going back to what happened under Margaret Thatcher when there was ODA was a separate department within the Foreign Office. It's not that. It's trying to make a merged entity work, but with this slight distinction. But look, let's. It's quite nice being Foreign Secretary, having a £12 billion pound budget. I didn't used to have that when he was Foreign Secretary. But anyway, let's try and make it work. But I'm happy to keep you up to date with how we think it's going.
Just very briefly, Foreign Secretary, on the definition of the ODA definition of aid, do you find it too restrictive and too narrow? There has been some redefining of it, but aid is still very much seen as economic, so we're not seeing peacekeeping operations over and above 15% counting as aid, when actually it's basic stabilisation, you could argue. And at the other end, the BBC World Service isn't covered being as part of aid, when you could say it is critical, especially when you're up against Russia Today, yeah. China TV. The World Service is critical when it comes to the development of civil society and broader concepts that we want to fund and support around the world.
Yeah, I'm a bit torn on this. I think there are times when you look at the definition. I remember there was one particular time where if an NGO did mine clearance, it was ODA, but if a military power did mine clearance, it wasn't. So there are frustrations. So I'm all for keeping an open mind about it and looking at whether we should change it. Why I'm in two minds is, of course, once you start, if you change it unilaterally, you open the door to everybody else to change it unilaterally, and then you get a lot of countries that were committed to ODA backing off. So, if you could make some general changes, multilateral changes in the way you suggest, then that would be a good thing.
Another way of doing that is just to say we're going to spend 0.4% or 0.6% on an international definition of ODA, and then we will spend 0.1% on our own definition, which is support the BBC World Service, support peacekeeping more. What you don't want to do, obviously, is have the Russians invade a country and then say it's aid, clearly, because that's an absurdity. But actually being tied to these rules and just saying, well, let's see, effectively nothing happens, and if we're not willing to make the changes, it's very difficult to see how other people will as well.
On the detail, I'm told that the BBC is partly funded by ODA.
A little bit.
I think that the danger would be that if you said, here's our 0.4% general definition, here's our extra bit which we define, that is opening the door to other countries doing things that we wouldn't in any way classify as ODA, and then you'd have, and remember, because of COVID, global poverty is increasing. There are more people going hungry. There are more people below the poverty line than there were. So the need for keeping ODA up is strong. So that's why I'm worried about it. But I'm happy to have a dialogue about whether there are changes we should push for multilaterally.
Well, can you move us into Israel-Gaza?
Absolutely, thank you. Can I just double check, Foreign Secretary, what are our objectives in Israel in relation to Israel and Gaza?
Our objective, first of all, above everything, is to try and help achieve some stability in the Middle East. In the short term, that is our goal, to see an end to this conflict. But our longer term goal is that we believe that there won't be true security either for Israel or for the Palestinians without moving towards a two-state solution. So we have a sort of short-term horizon of wanting to get to a sustainable ceasefire, which we can talk about, and then a longer-term horizon of recognizing that no ceasefire is really fully sustainable forever unless you actually have a political horizon.
And apart from our concern, are we doing anything like, for example, developing a roadmap, developing a peace plan with some of our Arab friends in the Middle East, Egypt, the UAE, and other countries?
Yes, we are. I've travelled to the region twice already, and I'm sure I'll be going again before too long. And even you don't have to travel to have the sorts of conversations we're having with, for instance, obviously European allies, the Americans, but also crucially with the Gulf and Arab states, about what the future should look like. And I think that fundamentally, there are four things have got to happen. Once this conflict is over, we've got to see a Palestinian-led government in Gaza and the West Bank. We need a concrete plan of support for that government and a plan to help reform and support the Palestinian Authority. We've got to see a massive reconstruction plan for Gaza after this conflict is over. And crucially, we've got to see a political horizon towards a two-state solution, because the way I see it is you won't get the sort of assistance on security, governance and technical help in Gaza after the conflict unless you can convince Palestinian authorities, Palestinian people and Arab states that you've got a longer term horizon towards a two-state solution.
Do you think that's remotely feasible?
I think
given everything that's happened.
Yes, you've got to hope that it's feasible. Out of a crisis should come some opportunity. And what's interesting in all the conversations I've had them with the Jordanians, the Egyptians, with the Emiratis, with the Saudis. There's an awful lot, and a lot of people would accept those sort of four planks of a plan in one form or another going together.
Does our current position damage our friendships with Arab nations?
Fundamentally, I would say it doesn't. It's definitely, there's stress there because, of course, the Arab states all want to see, have called for an immediate ceasefire. They're deeply concerned, as I am, by what's happening in Gaza and the loss of life. And so, to sit here and argue that it has no effect on our relations, the fact that we've said we want a sustainable ceasefire, I think would be stretching it. But I would say they understand that we're not being sort of deliberately difficult or obtuse about this. We are just very classically British, common sense, practical people, and I can't see a comprehensive ceasefire coming in now while Hamas are still able to launch rockets out of Gaza. So that's why we say sustainable ceasefire. So while they might be a bit disappointed in our position, they, I think, understand it and recognise that it does at least make internal logical sense. And I think they will work with us. Those relationships are very long-standing, as you know. They will work with us on this sort of agenda.
Bob, I'm going to bring you down on that point. Dan.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Foreign Secretary. Just to follow on to those points, Joseph Borrell has stated that the EU's position on Gaza, Israel, has damaged the EU's relationship with the Global South, and leaked US cables have said similar for the US. Do you feel that is the same for the UK?
Certainly, there are countries in the Global South, or however you want to term it, who want an immediate ceasefire, disagree with people that don't say that, and so that means you're in disagreement, and so perhaps your standing will suffer in some way. But I don't think we should just accept that and do nothing about it. I think we have to make our case very vigorously, as I do. I mean, when I meet, for instance, South African foreign minister, or talk to them, I would say, look, of course, I want this conflict to end as soon as possible. I don't want to go on for a moment longer than necessary. But a ceasefire to work has got to be sustainable. That means you can't have Hamas in power, able to launch rockets, not releasing hostages. That has got to be dealt with. And I think you get...
On
yes.
that, Foreign Secretary, do you believe that military intervention can defeat Hamas?
I think that what the Israelis are trying to do is they are trying to get rid of Hamas's ability to launch further attacks on Israel. I think you can do that. And one can disagree, and I would have differences with the way they've gone about it. Can you defeat an ideology through armed intervention? No, defeating an ideology is going to take a lot of other things, including progress towards a political solution to show that politics can work and deliver things. But I think if you take the argument there's nothing more that can be done militarily, you just have to freeze things where we are now, you've then got to make an argument, well, how do you get the remainder of Hamas out of Gaza, get rid of the rocket launchers, get rid of my challenge to those from the Global South or friends in Arab states is to say, okay, there's a ceasefire tomorrow. How do you get rid of Hamas's capacity to launch more rockets?
How will you know when that moment has come as British Foreign Secretary? And is it your hope that the UK will be voting for a ceasefire at the UN in the near future?
I would hope that we'll be voting. I mean, what we did is we defined what we wanted as a sustainable ceasefire. The Prime Minister said that at Prime Minister's questions, and within a few weeks that was adopted by the UN in Resolution 2720 with unanimous, not unanimous agreement because the United States didn't vote in favour, but without a veto. So that's our position. Yes, I look forward to the moment when this conflict is over. And of course, we spend a lot of time asking what Israel should do next to bring this to an end, to finish. We should also spend a nanosecond saying if Hamas wanted, they could end this tomorrow. They could lay down their arms. They could leave Gaza. They are the ones prolonging this conflict in many ways.
You've warned against an unsustainable ceasefire that quickly collapses into further violence. But there's a strong feeling, I think, in the international community and in the public that the longer violence continues and the further peace is away, that we're going to struggle to get to peace.
I don't disagree with that. We don't want this to go on. No, what I'd say first of all, I would be in favour of humanitarian pauses, including right now. I mean, let's have another pause to try and get hostages out and to get more aid in. I'd be happy for us to do that now. What I'm saying about sustainable ceasefire is it does need Hamas to no longer be capable of launching attacks into Israel. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. And I hope that moment comes as quickly as possible.
Florence, just to take you back for a moment, what is the UK's current legal position on whether or not Gaza is occupied?
Our position is that Israel is fighting a campaign against Hamas. We have to check regularly whether that is in compliance with international humanitarian law and assess that. I don't think Israel regards itself as an occupying force, but whether that is correct, I would want to take legal advice, because this comes to this issue about aid, where I think Israel needs to do more, a lot more, to get more aid into Gaza, which perhaps we can come on to.
Forgive me, we know that Israel does not consider itself to be an occupying power, but British law currently does consider Gaza to be an occupied power. Can you, an occupied territory? Can you just confirm that on the record?
I don't know the precise legal definition of that. I'd have to go back and check.
Philip? I think we all know that the Foreign Office does know what the official legal position is.
When we describe the territories as the occupied Palestinian territories, but
that's a different question.
That's a descriptor.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
We should give you a piece of written advice on the legal position.
I think what the chair's asking is, do we consider Gaza to be occupied militarily at the moment? Is that what you're getting at?
I'm asking for the British government's legal definition, whatever they consider to be the terminology of you occupied, because as I understand it, there is no question that in law, under British law and according to the UN Security Council Resolution 22334, on which we have based our legal position, Gaza is an occupied territory, and therefore from that, Israel does have obligations as an occupying power, whether or not they consider it to be or not. British law does state that, and I would consider it to be quite fundamental that we knew exactly from what premise we were operating when engaging in something so complex.
As you know, we refer to them as the occupied Palestinian territories, but obviously Gaza was left by Israel. But I think the question you're asking now is what Israel's done, is that technically an occupation, and therefore do they have legal obligation? The point I would make is, look, whether or not they are de jure occupying, they are de facto occupying Gaza, and therefore when it comes to this issue of aid delivery, we need them to do more. At the moment we're at about 150 trucks a day getting into Gaza. We need to be closer to 500. Every day that we're not closer to 500, we're going to have more people going hungry, we're going to have more people getting disease. There is a danger of there being really widespread hunger. At the moment, something like 90% of Gazans are getting less than one meal a day. And so I've set out with the Israelis a whole set of things that could happen, that they could do that would make a real difference. You know, make sure Kerem Shalom is open 7 days a week. Make sure the Nitzana checking point is open 24 hours a day. Make sure the aid convoys that are coming across Jordan have unhindered access into Gaza. Look at opening the port of Ashdod so aid can arrive by sea, go from Ashdod, either into Kerem Shalom or even better, go into the Erez crossing. Crucially, none of these things will work unless inside Gaza you actually have UN personnel, trucks and fuel capable of taking the aid around Gaza. And again, only the Israelis can really fix that, because there's a bunch of visa applications that are outstanding for people to be there. There's a need for armoured cars for that aid to be distributed and taken around with, and that needs to be fixed, and it needs to be fixed urgently.
I think I would also pay credit at this point to you, Foreign Secretary, for what the UK government has clearly done on aid. There is clearly much progress made as a result of that. But just for clarification, therefore, your words, Gaza is de facto occupied, and therefore Israel has obligations as an occupying power, which you are saying today you accept, at least when it comes to aid.
I'm saying they have. I'm not a lawyer, so I need to be careful. I'm saying they have responsibilities. No, I'm saying they've got responsibilities to make sure that aid gets through. It's not solely them. I've been to El Arish myself. There are problems with Egyptian bureaucracy. There's problem with the lack of sort of overseeing logistics, working out what aid is going where. There are other bottlenecks, but fundamentally there are some things the Israelis need to do because ultimately they have a lot of responsibility for what is happening in Gaza. I'm not giving you a legal definition because I'm not a lawyer. This is a moral and political point.
They are occupying, and in fact they are not currently doing all they could be doing on aid, and therefore what they should be doing. I want them to do more. Thank you. Graham.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. I just want to ask a quick question about more on the home front. I represent a very large Jewish community, very large Muslim community. Both communities are both angry and fearful about what's happening in Israel and Gaza. Is there anything, as Foreign Secretary, you can do to help the tension that those communities are feeling at the moment? Are you aware of the impact that it's having on those communities?
I am. I think everybody can feel it, whether they're living in London or in your constituency or in my old constituency. You feel it in so many of the conversations that you have. I think one of the most important things with both communities, but perhaps particularly with British Muslims, is to demonstrate that we are an aid superpower that's doing what an aid superpower should be doing, and that is getting aid into Gaza. And I've just spelled out, we've got the material. We've already delivered, I think, 74 tons of aid. We could deliver much more if we could deal with these bottlenecks. I think that is hugely reassuring. I think with the Jewish community, it's partly about demonstrating an understanding of just what a catastrophic event, what an appalling event the 7th of October was. I think sometimes people can forget, because of what's happened subsequently, just the scale. If you look at this country, the size of Israel, and to lose over 1,400 people in one day in those most horrific circumstances. And I've been to Kibbutz Be'eri and seen with my own eyes where, children were shot in front of their parents, where people were raped, the blood on the floor and the bullet holes in the wall. I mean, it's something you're never going to forget. This happened to a country that's a friend of ours and peace-loving people in these kibbutzes, and showing understanding that we understand why they feel so strongly about that event, and trying to put ourselves in their shoes, I think is really important.
Thank you. Can I just ask a number of quick factual questions? How many UK citizens remain in Gaza, and in particular in the north of Gaza?
In terms of the number of citizens in Gaza, I'm aware of, we've got a lot out, and the Israeli, Egyptian and authorities within Gaza have been helpful in doing that.
Can you be specific on numbers?
I know there are 2 who have got, who want to get out, who don't have any security clearance problems, but who haven't yet got out. What I don't have, but Philip's going to find me the number, we think there's quite a number still of British nationals or dual nationals who are in Gaza but who haven't asked to leave. Have we got a number?
So we can't give you a precise number. It will depend on who's...
Alex Chalk gave precise numbers on the 7th of November, where he said there were 100 Brits that had left Gaza and 100 were still in the country. So
that was a long time ago. I think most of those 100 have left. Well, the ones we don't know about are the ones that haven't declared and don't want to leave.
Those we know who declared, 50% have left.
More than that.
It's more than 300 now. People registered with us, British nationals and their dependents, have left with our assistance.
But the crucial, I think the crucial number is how many are there that are British nationals that want to leave and haven't left, and I think that's a very small number at the moment, but I'll get back to how I've got that wrong. And also it's worth recognising, because the department I think is doing a good job in difficult circumstances. There's also quite a number of people who have links to the UK. They might have the right to remain in the UK. They might be Commonwealth citizens from other countries who don't have representation in the region, but we do, who we're helping to get out. And there's also journalists and the families of journalists who have a British connection, as it were, because they might work for the BBC or what have you, who were helping to get out, not to come to Britain necessarily, but to carry on their work from Egypt or elsewhere.
Can we be specific about the number of UK nationals who remain as hostages?
Yes, there are 2
and
British
do we have
nationals.
proof of life?
There are 2 British nationals that remain as hostages. I don't want to make any further comment on them. There are also, of course...
Do we know they're alive, though?
I just don't want to say any more. We don't have any information to share with you. There are also, of course, people very connected to Britain who are also hostages, and we regularly, we're doing everything we can to try and help in both those cases.
How many hostages have we managed to get back to the UK?
I don't have the figures off the top of my head. There were. I'll have to write you about that. I don't have the figures. I don't want to give a false figure.
Forgive me, we aren't looking at 1,000 people when we're not sure. How many British nationals have been brought back who were hostages held by Hamas or Palestinian Jihad?
I don't. Yes. Go on.
So, Chair, Israel's obviously taking the lead in conjunction with international partners, including the UK, in trying to secure the release of hostages. We've been acting in support of that. We'll have to confirm. I don't think that the question, how many have the UK brought back to the UK, I don't think is the right way.
I'm going to be very fair to the Foreign Secretary and come back to you on this. A few of us were in Doha in December where we met with Roger Carstens, who is the US hostage negotiator. He can tell me in a minute's notice the names of all the hostages who are American who are still being held by Hamas, let alone the ones in Venezuela or anywhere else in the country, and he can most certainly tell me how many have been brought back to the UK, back to the US. How many have been brought back to the UK who had UK citizenship?
There are two, as the Foreign Secretary mentioned, have British nationality who are hostages. There are others who are connected to the UK through family ties. I think the answer to your question is brought back to the UK by the UK government is I think it will have to confirm.
I don't really care who brought them back. I care about British nationals who were held hostage. How many have been brought back?
Let me confirm after this, but I'll speak for myself rather than the Foreign Secretary. I don't think there are any.
Okay.
So the answer is 0.
I think that's right.
Okay. And I understand, and I will say from our discussions with the hostage negotiators, we know that citizenship is not being taken into account in terms of release.
Yes.
Whereas obviously many of us hoped at the start that maybe foreign nationals would be the first to be released. That's not the case. But as you understand at the moment, there are no British nationals who are being held by Hamas, and I understand why you may not feel able to share how many there are for various reasons, but no one has been able to be brought home as yet.
That's right. But one of the things I did when I got into the department was to make sure we're saying, yes, of course, we must make sure we do everything for British nationals, but there are people who've been taken hostage who are deeply connected.
Absolutely.
Sister of, brother of, son of, and we must do everything we can for them. And I think when you get into that category, there are people who are connected to British citizens who have been released.
You know how many?
Because then you're getting into, how many different connections there are. But of the British nationals, 2 and none have been released.
Right. One last question.
Sorry, Graham, please.
If I may, I mean, you may or may not know the answer to this, but are you able to assess the threat to British hostages from the IDF bombardment in the area, and have you made any specific representations to the IDF or the Israeli government to protect those hostages?
Yes, we raised the issue of not just the British hostages, but the hostages connected to Britain and the hostages more generally every time we speak with Israeli ministers. The last call I had was with Minister Dermer on Saturday morning. I raised the hostage issue with him then. We always raise that issue. And of course, in Israel itself, there's a huge lobby on behalf of hostages and wanting to get the hostages home and save the hostages. So yes, we raise it on every occasion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Moving to the conduct of the military operation, I'd be interested in your assessment of Hamas's current capability, how much it's been degraded and what their intent is.
I have to be careful what I say, but I mean, I've seen figures suggesting that they have lost well over 50% of their capacity and capability in terms of being able to launch rockets and all the rest of it. I don't think I can go further than that. But their ability to launch rockets into Israel has been significantly degraded. But as we've seen, they have still launched rockets in recent days.
The Israelis obviously said over the weekend that they'd now dismantled Hamas's military infrastructure in the north of Gaza. You touched on your answer to Dan about the need for pauses. Is that not perhaps an opportunity that we bring in a humanitarian pause in the north of Gaza? If Hamas has been dismantled, as the Israelis are saying they have succeeded in doing so, do we need to look at particular areas having humanitarian pause once it's appropriate? Otherwise, what is the objective currently in the north of Gaza as you understand it?
That's a very good point. I mean, what we have pushed for with Israel is to say consider humanitarian pauses. We haven't particularly focused on an individual area, but frankly, anything would help. When it comes to, there are still... I mean, most of the Gazans have moved from the north to the south, so it's more helpful to have a humanitarian pause covering the whole of Gaza, because then you can get to the aid where most of the people are. But frankly, anything would help. In fact, one of the issues we'd like the Israelis to look at is switching the water back on into northern Gaza, because that would make a difference. So all of these things, but it's a good thought.
I think one of the challenges, obviously, that hasn't been no place that they could go as yet that was safe. So perhaps that provides an avenue. President Biden, as I'm sure you saw, I raised, the Prime Minister has said that there has been indiscriminate bombings that have taken place. You warned on the 23rd of November that civilian casualties in Gaza were too high and that Israel must abide by international humanitarian law. How have you, as Foreign Secretary, achieved a reduction in civilian casualties?
What we've done on every occasion of talking to, whether it's the Israeli Prime Minister or President or Minister Derma or Minister Gantz, who I spoke with recently, always make the point that, of course, we believe Israel has a right to defend itself and to deal with the Hamas threat, but it has to do so within international humanitarian law. It should try and avoid civilian casualties, and we were very clear that they needed to do better in the south than they did in the north. They say today that they are moving from a sort of combat phase to more of a stabilization phase. I don't fully know what they mean by that, but we definitely want them to do everything they can to try to move to a phase where civilians are less under threat.
And forgive me, there's some sort of phrase the US used, which I'm not going to quote accurately, but something about friends in public, punches behind the scenes. Do we think the UK or the US, and obviously the US has taken the lead on then, have been unable to restrain Israel in any way in terms of the way that it has conducted its airstrikes?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I think that I'll answer a slightly different question, if I may. I think the relentless pressure that Israel felt over opening the Kerem Shalom crossing from us and from Americans and others, I think that did make a difference. They eventually relented. I would hope that what we've said, because we are a friend of Israel and we have been a helpful friend in many ways on many occasions, I hope they listen to us.
And so forgive me, when I asked the Prime Minister about the same topic, he said that he hadn't seen Israel's targeting. Have we asked to see Israel's targeting process or procedures?
I haven't seen it.
Have we asked to see it?
I haven't asked to see it. I don't think that that's something that they would share with us.
They would share their collateral damage percentage that they're working to if we were asking them to do so.
Well, they certainly, they've shared that in terms of, they point out, but one can say this is arguable, that they argue their collateral damage percentage compared with other conflicts shows that they are taking the issue of civilian casualties very seriously.
So maybe I could get.
But I think that's a difficult, that is a difficult one to.
I think it's a good way of holding them to account. And realistically, the UK normally operates. Forgive me, Royston might correct me, but I believe the UK normally operates around a 3% collateral damage percentage. There's obviously a ministerial sign-off for particular airstrikes where there may be requirement for a greater risk factor. Israel's must be operating at a 20, 30. I mean, in the past, in 2014, they said they were working at 20-something percentage. I'm just surprised that we don't know what their targeting percentage is in terms of, their civilian collateral damage percentage is, because that would be a direct way for us to have said to them, can you just get it down to below 10%?
That is, I mean, they do, in conversation, talk about what they think their percentages are. We don't think that's good enough, and we always push them to do more.
We do know what their percentages are, though.
We know what they say they have.
Okay. Final question from me before I move on to Brendan. During the hostilities in Gaza in 2014, your government decided to review licences for arms exports to Israel, and you committed not to grant any further licences until hostilities were ceased. I think there were 12 specific licences that you were concerned about at the time. Why has there been no review, cessation, pause, despite the fact there should be an automatic trigger that exists within the department to immediately suspend when there's a significant change on the ground?
Well, the way this works is that, as I'm sure you know, that the grant of licences is done by the Department of Trade on the advice of the Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office has to look at compliance with international humanitarian law based on an assessment of the commitment that Israel has, the capability that they have, can they actually deliver on this capability, and the compliance. And that assessment is carried out on a sort of rolling basis. And so it is sort of permanently reviewed, and where the circumstances to change and us to reach a different view, we'd advise the Department of Trade accordingly.
The immediate handbrake that, for example, after the terrorist attack in Kosovo, there was an immediate handbrake put in place in terms of sales of arms to Serbia. There was no immediate handbrake, as I am aware of, on this situation, despite there having been an enormous terrorist attack and then a response. And there hasn't been a specific review of licenses.
I think it's because of the circumstances. I mean, the circumstances are different because of October the 7th being such a hostile attack on Israel, and the government's position that Israel has a right to defend itself and a right to try and stop Hamas from launching future terrorist attacks, that there wouldn't be odd to have an automatic handbrake. What you have to do is assess on an ongoing basis, which is what we're doing.
Israel has a full right to defend itself in international humanitarian law, but the British government has a duty to ensure that its export licenses are for arms exports as accurate as they can be. So you are not aware of any review within the system formally. Rolling basis, the point of a rolling basis that you have the emergency handbrake for when it's needed.
Well, it's as you described. I mean,
but you put one in place, which is why I'm surprised that there hasn't been one in 2014.
Yes, but
when the casualties are so much higher this time.
Well, I think what I've described is what happens, which is it's a decision for the Department of Trade based on advice from the Foreign Office, and that process is properly gone through.
Okay. I just find it strange that when there were much lower levels of hostilities and activity, you put in place one as Prime Minister, and this time round, despite the circumstances being so much more serious, there hasn't been a review.
I think I've answered the question.
Brendan.
Thank you, Chair. Foreign Secretary, have you received any guidance or advice or received any submissions from FCDO or government lawyers that Israel may be in breach of international humanitarian law?
Say that again?
Have you received any legal advice from the FCDO or government lawyers that Israel may be in breach of international humanitarian law?
What I've received is advice as part of this process that I've just described to the Chair, and the advice then was passed on consistent with that advice, as it were, to the Department of Trade.
No, in terms of Israel's actions post October the 7th,
Yeah.
are you... Okay, let me ask you personally, have you seen any evidence, been made aware of any evidence, or have reasonable grounds to believe that Israel has breached international humanitarian law?
No. Well, what I have to do is act on the advice that I'm given, and that advice is based on what we believe is happening, and so we ask a whole series of questions of the Israeli government about individual actions that are brought to our attention, and then we receive advice on that, consider that advice, and then pass it on to the Department of Trade for them to make the decision about arms exports.
I understand your relationship with the Department of Trade, but what I'm asking you, Foreign Secretary, is have you been made aware or seen any evidence or have reasonable grounds to believe that Israel has breached international humanitarian law?
Not arms exports.
Nothing to do with arms exports. This is about the international
I've seen lots of things that have been deeply concerning, and when I do, I ask advice, and we often, as part of this arms export, we formally have to do that, ask advice about whether that is in fact in breach of international humanitarian law.
And in your assessment as Foreign Secretary, has Israel at any point in its response breached international humanitarian law?
My job is not to make the legal adjudication, because I'm not a lawyer. It's for me to consult my lawyers in the department and say, will you reach a judgment about whether this does breach international humanitarian law based on, as I said, the commitment, the capability and the compliance.
No, that takes me back to my initial question then. Have your lawyers in the FCDO or in government given you any advice as to whether Israel has breached international humanitarian law? Because you seem to be saying to us that it has been examined by the FCDO.
So I don't want to sound like I know what you're asking, and I don't want to
answer it.
Well, I don't want to be difficult. I don't want to give an inaccurate answer, and I don't want to, I've described to you the process because it's a process. So of course you see lots of things that you think, well, is that in line with international? Is that in line? And so that's a process that the Foreign Office has to go through to look at those instances, to put questions as part of this process to the Israeli authorities, to consider those answers, and then to give me the considered advice. Given all that, does that mean we think that Israel is in breach of human rights, international humanitarian law? If the answer is yes, one set of advice goes to the Department of Trade. If the answer is no, another set of advice goes. That's the way it works.
Okay, well let me take you away from process to more specifics. About 2 or 3 minutes ago, in answer a reply to the chair, you said, and I quote, "One of the things we'd like the Israelis to do is switch the water back on." Now, that says that they turned it off. It says that you recognise they have the power to turn it on. Therefore, isn't turning water off and having the ability to turn it back on but choosing not to, isn't that a breach of international humanitarian law?
It's just something they ought to do, in my view.
No, of course they should do it. Every human being would say you don't cut people's water supply off. But I'm asking you, in your position as Foreign Secretary, around the point of international humanitarian law, if Israel have the power to turn the water back on that they turned off, surely that is a flagrant breach of international humanitarian law.
Well, I'm not a lawyer. My view is they ought to switch it on, because the north of Gaza, the conflict is now effectively over there, and so getting more water and power into northern Gaza would be a very good thing to do. You don't have to be a lawyer to make a judgment about that, you just have to be a human being.
Forgive me, Sir Philip, under international obligations, do occupying powers have an obligation to provide access to water, yes or no?
You're asking me a technical legal question.
Sir Philip, I'm really, forgive me, you and I have played this dance enough times. We all know that under international law there is an obligation for occupying powers to provide water.
You're asking me a technical question about occupying powers and what their obligations are in international law. I imagine you're correct, Chair, but I'm also not a lawyer. I also just would point out,
Philip, just bear in mind, we've come to such a good place working with you, because we have the confidence that you do know these details, and that's what your colleagues say. You know that it is not that you presume I'm correct. That is the duty on an occupying power.
Yeah. Chair, I think that is right. So yes, but I would also add that in answering your questions earlier about occupying.
I'm not asking you to apply it to Israel. The facts are, though, that they are required to. And just, Lord Cameron, just to clarify, so you have received no advice at any point from any government lawyer that states that Israel is in breach of international humanitarian law?
That's not what I said.
No, that's why I'm asking you to clarify.
Yes, well, I'm going to give exactly the same answer all over again, which is what my role is, right?
I'm not interested in the role, I'm interested in the legal advice you've received.
Yes, well, the legal advice I've received is consistent with the fact that we have not changed our export
It's not about arms
procedures.
exports, it's about international humanitarian law being upheld when it comes to aid, when it comes to the way in which airstrikes have been prosecuted, everything else. We're one question on arms exports, we've moved from them. In any realm, in any respect. So you've never had a piece of paper put in front of you by a Foreign Office lawyer that says that Israel is in breach of its international humanitarian commitments under international humanitarian law?
Look, the reason for not answering this question, I can't recall every single bit of paper that's been put in front of me. I look at everything. I mean, of course, there are lots of things that have happened where you think, well, surely that was something that shouldn't have happened, and so I don't want to answer that question because
Forgive me, in 2013 you were quite happy to say from the dispatch box that war crimes had been committed by the Assad regime when it came to chemical weapons use, and 2 years later you were happy to say that Hamas had committed a war crime when they shot rockets into Israel.
Yeah, well, I do think there's a difference between using chemical weapons to kill people and Israel fighting a conflict where they're trying to deal with a terrorist force that inflicted an appalling attack on their country. It's a difference in
setting or specifics or scale, but not in principle, which was your willingness and ability to determine whether or not international law had been broken.
I'm not sure we're going to get a lot further with this. I mean, if you're asking me, am I worried that Israel has taken action that might be in breach of international law because this particular premises has been bombed or whatever? Yes, of course I'm worried about that, and that's why I consult the Foreign Office lawyers when giving this advice on arms exports. So that's why I don't. If you put it that way, I'm happy to say yes, of course. Every day I look at what's happened and ask questions about, is this in line with international humanitarian law? Could the Israelis have done better to avoid civilian casualties? Of course I do that.
We have no doubt that you'd ask those questions. It's about the response you've received.
Yeah, I understand the question that you want to answer, but the question that I want to ask is the point, have you received legal advice which says that Israel is in breach of international humanitarian.
The short answer to that is no. But I want to qualify it instantly, because it's not fair on the lawyers, because of course the lawyers give you lots of advice saying, look, we're worried about this event, that event, this event, that event. We're going to go away, we're going to consult with the Israeli authorities, we're going to ask a bunch of questions, and then we're going to give you considered legal advice, given everything, on the basis of, capability, commitment and everything else. Have they broken international law? So that's why it's not really a yes or no answer. But I'm trying to be helpful by sort of explaining how the job works.
Okay,
does that help at all?
No. But unfortunately, I think it's as good as we're going to get from you. Can I ask, finally, Chair, Foreign Secretary, what assessment have you made of the Israeli ambassador's claim that every school, mosque and every second house in Gaza has access to tunnels and ammunition? Now, she said that in a television interview, and when pressed on whether that means the complete destruction of Gaza by Israel, she replied, and I quote, "Do you have another solution?" So in your opinion, was she freelancing when she was speaking to that television interviewer, or was she speaking for the Israeli government?
I don't agree with that approach. Look, if you're asking me...
No, I'm not asking you about the approach. I'm asking you about, do you think she was speaking to the Israeli government, or was she freelancing?
I don't know. I would hope that is not the position of the Israeli government, because it's the wrong position.
Okay, thank you.
Just very quickly on this point, and I'm not trying to scratch the same sore.
Well, I'm trying not to be difficult. By the way, none of the individuals released so far live in the UK. No British hostages have been released, as I said. I didn't want to give a broad answer.
I don't want to bang on the same point, but I want to try to ask it in a slightly more productive way. I'm not asking you to be a faux lawyer. Okay. I'm also very aware that in Hamas you have an organisation which doesn't pretend to do anything by any moral justification that we recognise, that it slaughters people, that it rapes people, that its approach to sexual violence is despicable, etc., etc. And I also understand that Israel, probably rightly, feels that the world is always very quick to judge its actions and really never bothers to judge the actions of those people, be it Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis who are trying to attack it. Having said that, reading between the lines, what you seem to be saying is not that you've had lawyers say that they're breaching international law, because actually it's very difficult to argue that, because you have to understand the Israelis' legal approach to what they're doing and how they judge proportionality. But I'm assuming, reading between the lines, that your lawyers are saying that potentially the Israelis are vulnerable to a challenge from the Hague Court and from elsewhere, that in some of the things they are doing, in potentially relation to proportionality, there is a vulnerability. Is that a better way of asking?
Close to that. It's close to that. Look, in all these cases, there's a question mark as to whether it is in breach of international humanitarian law, and that's why you have to go back, look at the episode of what in particular was bombed, and then ask yourself a bunch of questions, which is what the lawyers do, and they give you that advice. The advice has been so far that they have the commitment, the capability and the compliance, but on lots of occasions that is under question.
Right.
That's hopefully a better way of putting it.
There's always a law-governed process.
There's always a question, as you'd expect.
Please.
Thank you, Chair. Foreign Secretary, 10 years ago you were very outspoken on Gaza being what you called an open-air prison. I just want to say some of the statistics today that I have for the record, where 1.9 million people have been displaced, 70% of Gaza's residential buildings have been destroyed, most schools have been destroyed, most hospitals have been rendered inoperable. And this week the International Criminal Court will hold public hearings on South Africa's application under obligations relating to the Genocide Convention. Could you give your views on that, the government's views?
Well, first of all, on the South Africa case I think it's the International Court of Justice rather than the International Criminal Court, but I don't think that is helpful. I don't agree with it. I don't think it's right. I don't think we should bandy around terms like genocide in this case. I don't think that's correct. That doesn't change our long-standing position that ultimately it is for courts to decide to define genocide, not for states. But I'm very, very clear about that. In terms of what I said about Gaza, it's been unsatisfactory for years. The fact that there has not been, better access to and from Gaza, and the situation in Gaza
It's not for courts to determine, is it? It's for states who are party to the convention.
No, it is ultimately the long-standing position of the British government on all questions of genocide. Philip will pick me if I've got this wrong. Is that it's not for a government to say that's genocide. It's for a court, the ICJ or the ICC, to determine genocide.
It's not for the UK government to consider the risk of genocide in any case.
Of course, if we want to, as we have on other occasions, put information into a court when they're considering a question, we are at liberty to do that. And we've done that, I think, in the case of what has happened recently in Burma. Predates my time as Foreign Secretary. But you're asking me specifically about the South African case. I don't think, our view is that Israel does have a right to defend itself, must act within international humanitarian law, should avoid civilian casualties, should do better on that grounds, but we don't believe that calling this genocide and claiming this is genocide is the right approach, and we don't agree with what South Africa is doing.
Thank you. Ranil.
Lord Cameron, I actually agree with you that sometimes it's not about the technical IHL definitions, and it's around that gut feel of, is this right or is this wrong? So can I pivot to another issue around the West Bank? Because what's your view of the increase in violence that there's been there? And have you had conversations with the Israeli government to try and reduce it?
Yes, I agree with you. I think what is happening in terms of settler violence is unacceptable. I've raised this, I think, in every conversation I've had with Israeli interlocutors. And we've gone one further than that, which is working with the Home Office. We have put in place travel bans on those people responsible for settler violence. And we have the opportunity, should we judge it right, to move that from a travel ban up to a full sanction, which obviously includes the travel ban and the asset freeze and other things. So we keep a very clear eye on this. It is not right what is happening. It's also, as well as being terrible for the Palestinian people that live there, this is long-term, very bad for Israel, because Israel needs fundamentally a two-state solution in order for it to have the security it needs. And so it needs to make the West Bank as a functioning political space.
So why are we only seeing escalations then in the violence? Given that you're making representations, others are making representations, why is this not working?
I think it's a range of things. You've got, because of what happened on October the 7th and what's happened subsequently, you've got a rise of tensions across the occupied Palestinian territories and in the West Bank. You've got the extreme, settler movement who, have been perpetrating these acts. You've got some politicians in Israel that don't call them out, indeed even support them. And that's why it's very important that proper friends of Israel, including Britain, do call this out and are very clear about it.
So, given that you've announced that you're going to, we have banned settlers from entering the UK, what would be the trigger to up that to full sanction? What would be the trigger in your mind?
I think it's a very good question, and I can't give you an absolute hard and fast answer. I think a sense that if this continues, if it gets worse, if more acts are carried out, then we'd consider taking the travel ban up to a full sanction.
But more acts being carried out, they are being carried out. This is happening all the time. So I must press the point.
No, I know, and I don't. I mean, if you're asking for a sort of matrix for the decision, I don't have one. But it's a very good point, and I'll go away and think about it. But there's no hesitation. I mean, our view is this is not right. We need to act. You should use your sanctions and your deterrence in the smartest way you can, and we're happy to do that.
Very quickly before Royston takes us into the wider conflict, you touched earlier about the need for reconstruction, your first answer. Israel has said that they are looking to the EU and the US to reconstruct and pay for the reconstruction of Gaza. Can I ask if you agree with that?
I think it's going to take a giant international effort because the level of the destruction is so great. I think we're going to have to try and bring together, I know this is something that your committee's looked at, bring together a whole group of countries that include the Arab and Muslim states. We're going to have to bring together the main European powers and America into some form of contact group that works on this together. We're going to need as many people as possible to join the effort.
Should it not be for Israel, though, to lead on the reconstruction? I mean, to go to Randall's point, they were able to find $70 million to fund the expansion of illegal settlements over the next year, despite lobbying by this government to stop that. Surely Israel should be leading on the reconstruction of Gaza.
I think it will take more than any one country to do this.
And then very briefly on the point you touched on the contact group, obviously I have been urging the creation of a Palestine contact group. One of those aspects would be, for me, the priority is track 2 diplomacy. We need to get civil society, women, youth, other groups in the room who are ready to talk about a long-term peace. The day after, as His Majesty from Georgia wishes to refer to it as. Are we even anywhere close to bringing together track 2 diplomacy? Because that is something the UK could lead on and could do now.
I think there's a lot of conversations taking place about this. Obviously, one of the difficulties is some countries have been less inclined to talk about it until the conflict is over. But I think you've seen in recent days, an Egyptian plan. You've even seen the Israelis talk about what should happen in Gaza after this conflict is over. So I think the space is opening up, but the conversations are taking place now.
Apologies.
Foreign Secretary, thank you for joining us here today. When we started this inquiry, it was about the Middle East and North Africa, but it's morphed into something which is maybe not predominantly, but certainly Israel-Gaza related. But there's a bigger issue, which is why we were looking at the Middle East before October the 7th. And one of the issues which I'm sure we'll come to, which is Yemen, and how we, as the UN penholder, how we deal with that, how we're seen to be playing our part. But before we come to that, what is your sense of what's happening in the south of the Red Sea, and what are we, the government, and you, the Foreign Secretary, doing to prevent contagion in the region?
I think what's happening in the Red Sea is extremely dangerous, in that you've had repeated Houthi attacks on not just Israeli shipping, as they would claim, but on all shipping. And I think you have to, in some ways, try and separate this from the conflict for a second and think, is it acceptable that one of the most important sea lanes in the world is effectively being closed by a group that are unacceptably and illegally and continually attacking shipping? My answer is no, it's not, and that's why we, with others, set up Operation Prosperity Guardian. That's why we have British destroyers and potentially frigates involved in it. And that is why you heard the Defence Secretary say so clearly that, if this continues, then we have to consider what further action could be taken. So I think, of course, no one wants to see escalation of conflict in the Middle East, but I think it's unacceptable to have the freedom of navigation affected in this way. So that's the position we take.
What is your sense of why the Houthis are involving themselves? Now, they would say that it's the Palestinian cause, and they feel that they should do what they can to take the side of the Palestinians against what they see the aggressor, the Israelis.
So that is exactly what they say. They're also, in some ways, a proxy for Iranian action, and that is what they say. But fundamentally, the effect of what they're doing is to stop the freedom of navigation, the free flow of goods and manufacturers and oil and everything else, which is important to countries in the region and countries in the world. And I just don't think we can accept this continued prevention of the freedom of navigation. So that's what they say, but it's illegal, unacceptable, has to stop.
That's what they say, but what do you think? Why now? Why would they want to embroil themselves in this? I mean,
very good question. I think partly it's a sort of competition for attention, for voice, for making them more popular in the world they want to be in by taking action because of what's happening in Gaza. But they need to be told, as they have been told, that this is not a sort of free option, that consequences follow. First of all, we will, I think actually the British destroyer, it was the first time British destroyers shot down a hostile aviation thing in about 30 years. So they need to be told that it's unacceptable, but speculating on exactly why they're doing it, exactly why they continue is important, but it's hard to know exactly why.
We talk about the roadmap for peace proposed by the Saudi government, and I believe they're in discussions with the Houthis now although depending on who you talk to, you'll find that the Houthis are cited of the peace proposal, are discussing it with the Saudis, but others in Yemen are being excluded. What's your sense of that? And do you see the same thing that we have been told by others, that this is sort of turning into a Houthis-Saudi deal as opposed to a Yemen solution, which may be, in the way that Gaza and Israel may be, a two-state solution?
I think what I see, and I'd praise the Saudis for doing this, is a genuine attempt at a peace process to bring this long-standing conflict to an end. And these processes only work if you include all the relevant participants in it. I mean, if you take a step back and ask why we're in this situation, I think there's a good case to be made that if you go back, 10 years to when this conflict began, and maybe we could apply this to other situations, that, for all of the difficulties of dealing with the Houthis, if you leave a significant part of a country out of a peace process, it doesn't work. So I would applaud the Saudis for what they're doing. I hope this peace process is yielding results. It looks like it is. It looks like they've made real progress. But that doesn't mean the Houthis can go about attacking ships in the Red Sea. And in fact, I think if you ask the Saudis what their view is, they would say that pretty clearly too.
Which brings me to the point of why they might be doing it. But the argument is that the Houthis are having these discussions with the Saudis, but the south of Yemen are being excluded. And back to your point that you can't have a peace process unless everyone's involved, then it looks to me like there may be a flawed process. And of course, we are the pen holder. We've spoken, when we were in Doha a few weeks ago, we've spoken to the US envoy. The UN envoy has just come back from Muscat. I mean, everyone's talking about this, but there are groups of people in Yemen that feel they've been excluded.
Well, you make a good point. Let me take that away. But I think I would apply it to, Afghanistan, Iraq, all these situations. Fundamentally, if you want to try and bring peace after conflict, you need to include all the parties to that conflict and all the parties in the country to have the best chance of success.
One final, if I may, on a peaceful solution to the region, the Abraham Accords, and indeed, although not the Abraham Accords, but Saudi normalisation with Israel. Do you think that those agreements, those arrangements are now in jeopardy because of what's happening in Israel-Gaza?
I think my instinct is that if you go to the Emirates or Bahrain or Morocco, they're very committed to what they agreed to. They see it as a good advance. It's obviously under some pressure because of local opinion, but I think they're committed to it. I think actually the Saudis, in the medium term, would still like to get that back on track. I think there's a genuine view that part of peace for this region is recognition of Israel by these major powers, but it needs to be accompanied by, you can't leave the Palestinians out of this equation. You've got to have the Palestinians feeling that they can live in dignity and security in the Palestinian territories with a state of their own.
Do you think, therefore, last question, Chairman, well, we talked about it's going to have to be an international effort to rebuild Gaza. Do you think that it is incumbent on the Middle Eastern Gulf countries and others to be the largest part of that solution?
They've obviously got huge capabilities and capacity to do that, but I think it's going to be quite a diplomatic effort to get everybody around the table and to get everybody to contribute, as the Chair rightly pointed out.
Thank you.
You didn't touch too much the foreign sector in Iran. Bob, do you want to quickly...
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just very briefly, I know it's a big subject, and I know we're trying to be very tight on time. To what extent do you see Iran as an opportunistic manipulator of events, or to what extent do you see Iran effectively as the prime mover behind what is happening, and not only against Israel but also against Saudi, using these various proxies that Iran has, be it proxies in Iraq, be it Hezbollah, be it the Hamas, or be it the Houthis?
I think it's probably the first of your propositions, in that it's clear that, what all these organisations have in common, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Hezbollah, the Houthis, or Iran-backed armed groups in Syria and in Iraq, they all have the support of Iran in common but I think they have quite a lot of agency to act on their own. And so I think it's the first of the suggestions you make.
And that's the FCO's view, that they have agency.
I think
my
view very strongly is that Iran is a malign influence in the region. I said that very clearly in an interview the other day. There's no doubt that they give weapons, they give training, they give ability, they give money, they give support to all these groups. I mean, we know that. We know that Houthi weapons come from Iran. We know that Hezbollah rockets come from Iran. We're not. So we know that, but the way you put the question was, do we think that these groups are backed by Iran, manipulated by Iran, but ultimately are able to make some of their own decisions? If that's the way you put it, I would say it's that, yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. This committee warned against the deprioritising of the Middle East, and I just wondered if on reflection you regretted that in the last integrated review and refresh there wasn't a single mention of Palestine or the Middle East peace process, and whether you can explain that.
Well, the integrated review and the refresh actually was sort of before my time, but I'll own up to another sin, if you like, which is I think that if you go back to sort of 2008, 9, 10 onwards, there were some real efforts to get the peace process underway. Actually, my predecessor Gordon Brown wrote a brilliant article in the Guardian today about it. Barack Obama made a huge effort when he was president. But look, they didn't ultimately, they kept getting stalled, and Israeli politics kept going in a direction that made it very hard to make progress. And I remember something Obama said to me, which is, because I was pushing him, come on, Barack, we've got to do more. And he was saying, look, David, we can't want this more than they want it, i.e. more than the Palestinians and the Israelis want it. And that's true, but nonetheless, it's one of those things, looking back, you just wish that even more had been done.
I'm not sure that answers why it's been missed out of the...
What does it say? I only joined the government a month ago, so I can't answer that question. But it's always been the British government's view, and it never changed through the change of prime ministers, that the two-state solution is the answer to the Israel-Palestine conundrum. That's been absolutely consistent policy all the way through. What I was trying to say is that I think there have been moments of great effort and action, and moments when Israeli politics is going the wrong way, global financial crisis takes over, other problems, Iranian mischief rises, and it's harder to get this moving. In my time as Prime Minister, it was very difficult to get this dossier moving. And I think, to be fair to my successors, that's been the case subsequently. And Israeli politics has just moved in a completely different direction. Where it was hard to find anyone who supported a two-state solution. Now, hopefully, out of this crisis, we can try and start again to make the long-term argument that the only way you get true peace and security is a two-state solution. But it will be a hard ask.
I think a lot of us would agree with the assessment you've just made. I think this committee has been very critical of the fact there was not a single reference to Palestine or the Middle East peace process in the IR or the IR refresh, and the writing was on the wall. In June last year I gave a speech where I said we were going to see the Gaza crisis of 2023. That was not because I have a crystal ball, but it's because I listened to our Arab partners. I think it's absolutely vital, all of us on this committee feel very strongly that, exactly as per your sentiment, we cannot allow this time to be the time that we fail. We must move forward. On the point of moving forward, I will also now move us on to other areas. Fabian, you wanted to look at the Middle East.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Foreign Secretary, I hope you'd agree that Libya is a crucial country, given where it is geopolitically and given the total mess it's in, with effectively no state and different factions fighting for the oil wealth and the exploitation of that oil. In 2016, this committee condemned your decision to intervene in Libya as not having been based on accurate intelligence, as an opportunistic exercise in regime change, and as having created a humanitarian crisis. With hindsight, would you agree?
The short answer to that is no. I remember reading that report, and I think it was my fellow Conservative who was largely responsible for it, the Member of Parliament for... I mustn't introduce him by getting his name wrong, but anyway, I'll think about that. The information I had at the time, and I don't think it was inaccurate, was that Colonel Gaddafi was heading towards Benghazi, where he was threatening to kill large numbers of his own population, and we'd seen evidence of him doing that already. And we acted in order to prevent what could have been a huge humanitarian crisis and slaughter. And I think the information on which we acted was correct, and I disagree with the report. But I haven't read it for many years, but I remember reading it in 2016 or 17 and thinking it was bunk.
Well, I wasn't a member of the committee myself at the time, so I'm not going to take ownership of it. But
I suggest not calling any of our reports bunk.
I
an initial warning.
That's yes.
I'm sure that there were many good things in the report, but that particular point, and the idea that as Prime Minister you would launch some action in Libya on the basis of what? What I don't know. That you thought it'd be a good idea for no reason. I mean, we were genuinely concerned that there was going to be a slaughter.
And I'm sure we all understand
and by the way,
that.
So was Nicolas Sarkozy, so was Hillary Clinton, and that's why the action took
Foreign
place.
Secretary, the problem is that we now have effectively no state there, no government. We have competing factions. We have warlords in the shape of people like Khalifa Haftar. We have different countries, state sponsors of armaments to the different factions. And it's a total mess. And through all that, many refugees coming from sub-Saharan Africa are going through Libya instead of staying in Libya to help rebuild that state and returning remittances back to their own countries, and they are crossing the Mediterranean into Italy and into Europe. Now, surely there must have been, some of that must have been the consequence of that intervention. Would you agree?
Well, what I'd agree with is that the end of the intervention, when we wanted, and the French and others wanted to help the Libyan factions come together, they did not want any foreign boots on the ground. There was a Libyan national opposition, which was relatively well formed up at the time, but they wouldn't accept outside assistance in that way, and they said that that would make things worse rather than better, and that's the decision that they took. And so ultimately, I'd say they failed to take the opportunity to have the help that might have been necessary to try and take armaments out of Libya, to try and get the different groups together to form a more cohesive whole. And they didn't take that opportunity. But we were offering that opportunity. I remember actually bringing the leader of the Libyan National Opposition to the G8 in Northern Ireland, I think, in 2013, to have exactly that conversation. But it wasn't something we could make work. And there was obviously, after the Iraq War, great nervousness about putting boots on the ground, but we were willing to try different things if they wanted to, but they didn't want to.
The blame lies squarely with the Libyans rather than outside interference or intervention.
Well, it's up to you to decide what you think. My view is it was right to intervene. It was right to stop Gaddafi killing his own people. It was right to give that country a chance of a brighter future. They didn't want to have that help in reconstruction, and that's the view that I take.
Can I move us to the other end of the Maghreb, to Morocco? And I'll declare my interest in that I was a guest of the Moroccan Parliament on a visit in October of 2022, refer to my members' declaration of interest in the register. But my question is this, that Morocco is a stable country with a functioning democracy. It is of huge strategic importance to the UK, and we have a long-standing relationship with it. Would you agree, and what will you do as Foreign Secretary to further the partnership that we have with this country that is so important geopolitically and can supply us with green energy and has just built this massive port at Tanger Med, which is doing so much to help international trade into Africa?
Well, first of all, I've spoken to my opposite number, the Moroccan Foreign Minister, I think twice actually, but certainly once since taking this job, and I think the relations are in a very good place. I think there's a lot of bilateral cooperation on all the sorts of areas that you describe. I think there's a huge appetite on behalf of Morocco to play a bigger role in the region, and indeed when it comes to the Middle East peace process, as well as to be far more sort of outward going and outward facing about trade and investment and partnerships and everything else. So I think it's a very good opportunity for a strong relationship.
There are partners in helping to bring about the two-state solution. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think that of all the countries, well, I don't want to sort of single that too much, but I've had lots of conversations with countries that have an interest in how we move forward, and they've been some of the most forward-leaning and enthusiastic about the role they might be able to play, but also very enthusiastic about the bilateral relationship and what more we can do together.
Thank you. Rana.
Just very quickly, so you've said there's an enthusiastic relationship between Britain and Morocco. You've said that they're a partner in some of our endeavours. So given that there is the long-standing dispute over the Western Sahara and the United States recognised Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara in 2020, which helped unlock normalisation of relations with Israel for Morocco, why won't we?
We don't. I mean, I'm very happy to take this away and look at it. Whenever I've asked this question before, because I remember as Prime Minister, it was always, when you were preparing for Prime Minister's questions, someone would throw in, what about Western Sahara, just to see if you're on your game. And I think I don't see a case for change, but I'm very happy to take it away and have a look.
Turn to Ukraine, Bob.
Is conflict in Israel, Gaza, hampering international support to Ukraine, do you think?
It's certainly taking attention away from Ukraine, which I think is a pity, and I think it's the job of the strongest supporters of Ukraine, of which I would say Britain is rightly one, to do everything we can to keep it as high up the agenda as possible, to keep the partnership and coalition of countries that back Ukraine as strong and united and as purposeful as possible.
How confident are you in the UK's ability to continue to support Ukraine in a prolonged conflict? And let me just give you two pieces of concern. One, because of potentially what might happen next year in the US elections. And secondly, because there is a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that supplies to the Ukrainians are beginning to dry up, that we are being slow to commit, that other countries in Europe are being slow to commit. And if the Ukrainians are needing over 2 million 155 and 152 shells a year to hold positions, and they're getting an estimated half of that, we are effectively undermining their ability to defend themselves against the Russian state, which is now on a war economy footing when we are not.
Yeah. I'd say, I mean, the way you ask the question is, do I think the UK will continue to commit? Absolutely. I think that it's very good that there's such cross-party consensus about this. This is not an issue of contention in British politics, whereas it is a little bit more in American politics and in some European countries. There's wholehearted support, I think, from people in this country for the economic, diplomatic, military support, and indeed the way people took Ukrainian refugees into their own homes speaks to that. I think we understand the danger of letting European boundaries be redrawn by force and the danger of not responding to aggression. So I've got great confidence in that. I think where I'd agree with you is, of all the things I've seen on becoming Foreign Secretary with respect to this sort of dossier, I've been incredibly impressed by the work that's been done, the support, the way we're working with the Ukrainians, the diplomatic support, all that is and the leadership we're giving internationally is great. I think the one area I want to see more, and where I'm talking with the Defence Secretary and the Prime Minister about, is how we do more to get our and others' production of arms and armaments for Ukraine onto more of a sort of mobilised footing. Right. And I think there's more to be done on that. I don't have an answer today, but I'm very focused on it.
We are still not on that mobilised footing, and if the Americans for any reason pull back in their support, are you confident that the UK and its European allies can make up the difference, considering that actually our support, probably our total supply of 155 shells, could have the Ukrainians going for a month at their current rate of 5,000 to 7,000 shell usage in a summer day?
Well, the figures are, in terms of military support, if you add the UK and Europe together, in terms of military support, we're about equivalent to what the US has done. So the direct answer to your question is we really need the Americans to come forward with this package. I'm pretty confident that they will, because ultimately there is a majority in Congress for it. I mean, I've been on the Hill myself and had meetings with everyone from the Speaker to Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is not that supportive. But there is a majority. So I think that will happen. But the point is, that's not enough. Just we want the European support to go through. That needs to happen. We want the US support to go through. We're going to have our package, which we'll be announcing shortly. We need all those three things. But as well as that, we got to recognise now that as well as helping Ukraine through this winter and to help them take the fight to Russia, particularly in terms of the attacks they've made on Russian facilities in Crimea and warships and the rest of it. As well as that, we need production on a more industrialised
Before we go on
footing.
to the next question, can I just ask for greater clarity from the FCO and the Defence and the Ministry of Defence about our level of supply, but also greater clarity over the European Union's level of supply. And I ask that not because we want to give secret information and make it public, but because if we know that we're giving 2 million shells a year to the Ukrainians, it is important that the Russians know that they cannot just wait for us to fade away. So you need that clarity of supply. Can you give us that
what I can give
today?
you is that our commitment is such that with our allies we want to demonstrate to Putin very clearly that he cannot wait us out, that we are prepared to support Ukraine through 24, 25, 26. We are prepared to give that support because this is absolutely the challenge of our generation. I don't want to get into numbers on shells and all the rest of it, but add up the GDP of the countries of the coalition and we outrank Russia 25-1. So, it should not be impossible for us to get on a sufficient industrialised footing to
takes
deliver
willpower, because you could say that with Afghan 100 times over, and that didn't work out so good in the end.
I think there's a very big difference with a war on our continent that we can see, and we can see the effect on our security so directly that I don't sense any slippage in this country for support for Ukraine. When I talk to European foreign ministers, there's huge enthusiasm for doing as much as we can.
We're still not on the war footing. We're still not.
Well, no, and I've
footing.
answered that question, which is we need to do more on that front.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry.
Foreign Secretary, thank you for appearing before us. Turning to a different part of the globe, the British Indian Ocean Territory, you'll be aware that negotiations have been going on between London and Port Louis for just over a year now on future sovereignty. Diego Garcia has been extremely strategically important, both in the Cold War, in various actions in Iraq, Afghanistan, now with a new Cold War, and indeed the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. What is your view on the strategic security and military importance of British sovereignty remaining over Diego Garcia?
I started this session saying that I thought that we face a very insecure, dangerous, difficult world with conflicts and the need to maintain our security, to strengthen our alliances, to hold our friends close, to protect ourselves as well as we can. And we should think about this issue in that context, which is Diego Garcia is an important national asset that we share with its use with the Americans. And in any negotiation we have with the Mauritians, the overriding question must be the safety, security, usability of this base. That's it. That is the thing that matters more than anything. And we must look at all the risks and all the dangers that there could be in any change of circumstance. And that's the way we'll proceed.
There's been precedent in the past in terms of negotiations over the future of British overseas territories. The Anglo-Sino agreement on Hong Kong was very much lauded at the time, but now frankly isn't worth the paper it is written on. Are you concerned that, again, with growing Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean, in many former Commonwealth countries around the world, from the Caribbean to the Pacific, that a treaty on the future of the British Indian Ocean Territory, the Chagos Islands, would be vulnerable to future Chinese and potentially other states abusing that, and us then essentially surrendering a very important security situation.
No, I think that's
for the Americans as well, of course.
That's absolutely the right question, and that's the question I'm asking, which is that any negotiated outcome has got to be beyond doubt that there's no danger to this vital national US-UK asset of not being able to function and operate properly. Whether that is Chinese influence, whether it is what happened in the future to Mauritius, what might happen with other states and the outer islands. I mean, all those questions are absolutely front and centre in my mind in looking at this issue.
Are you concerned that this negotiations might be setting a dangerous precedent for other British overseas territories that are either uninhabited or are very sparsely populated? So I'm not talking about Gibraltar, which has a very functioning democracy and a clear will, or indeed even the Falkland Islands, but perhaps South Georgia, the South Sandwich Islands.
Again, great question. I think look, what's happened is a advisory judgment by the International Court of Justice. It's an advisory judgment, not a final judgment. And we have to think very carefully about the effect of concluding a negotiation that changed the nature of our arrangements with Diego Garcia that could be used as a precedent in other cases. And I don't think it's just necessarily the less inhabited overseas territories. There'll be other situations and assets that we have that are particularly important. So I think you're asking, the questions you're asking are the questions I'm asking, and I won't be happy unless we have very good answers to those questions.
And just finally, if I may, I'm very pleased to hear you talk about the judgment as an advisory judgment. It's not like a domestic court of law, as you know, where a jury decides. It's often where countries who historically are not allies or friends of the UK use it as an opportunity to essentially make a statement against British interests around the world. Are you concerned that it also may set a dangerous precedent for the sovereign base areas in Cyprus?
Again, I feel we are positively joined at the hip over these questions. These are all the questions that I'm, come into the department and have, checked the progress that we're making on this issue. When I was Prime Minister, it was all about trying to see if we could relocate Chagossians back onto the outer islands, and lots of work was done, and it wasn't possible. And it's exactly what I'm asking. As I say, there's a negotiation ongoing. The absolutely crucial thing is the safety, security, long-term viability of this base in a difficult and dangerous world. And anything that gets in the way of that is a major problem, and we have to consider. And we also, as a country that has other overseas possessions and territories, some of which have very important intelligence and security assets on them, we have to think of the effect on those. So it's all of those questions. If they can all be resolved, then that would be good. If they can't, then obviously we're going to have to think very carefully about this.
Thanks, Henry. A few months ago, I was a guest of the Kosovan government so that I could go into the weapons that were used on the 24th of September Bankska terror attack. I know, Foreign Secretary, that you've just returned from Kosovo yourself. Is it not long overdue for the UK to publicly share its conclusions on what took place that day?
What do you mean by that? I mean, we have a pretty clear view about what happened that day. I'm not really aware that what you want us to write it down and
I
publish
want the British government to share with the world what its assessment is. So far, all it has said is that it was a terror attack, that it was awful. It hasn't said who armed the militia. It hasn't said publicly the fact that all of the serious weaponry that was being used had serial numbers that lined up identical, that were from 2021 and came directly from the Serbian military. They haven't said whether or not Belgrade commissioned it. There have been no public...
It's a very good question. I mean, my view, rather like yours, is having been there, is that the Banska attack, could have been really quite a chilling event. Because if you look at the quantity of arms that were brought into Kosovo, if you look at the number of people, had this group not been interrupted by a Kosovan police operation, you could have had a whole string of attacks on Kosovan police stations. You could have had roadblocks. You could have had a really, this was not light weaponry. There were mortars. There was some very heavy equipment there. So if you're saying it would be good to set out what the dangers are, what the risk, the full extent of our knowledge, I'm very happy to take that away. I mean, I'm fully aware of how dangerous it was, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to go to Kosovo and wanted to meet with K4 and the commanding officers and meet with the British troops and others and try and make an assessment for myself about the nature of what is happening in Kosovo.
That would be enormously helpful. I understand another country, a Five Eyes country, has indeed delivered an entire investigation, but they're unwilling to publish those results. So I think for the UK to demonstrate resolve by explaining exactly what happened that day, because Vučić still says that what happened that day did not happen. NATO dismissed my concerns when I said last year that there were weapons being smuggled illegally into Kosovo by militias and stored in churches, and that is pretty much exactly what happened, despite the British government and NATO saying that wasn't what was happening. There is still, on the world stage, no government has come forward and said, this is what happened, this is who armed them, this is where it comes from. But actually, I'm less interested. Well, the truth matters, and we know in the Balkans there's a lot of effort taken to dismiss the truth and rewrite the truth. But I'm interested in why there's been no response from the EU and the US in particular, who have, the EU's put negative measures on Kosovo. There is an incredible imbalance in fairness in the way in which Kosovo is being treated. Given your visit and given what you saw, given that the UK has opted out of the Quint grouping and the Pristina-Belgrade dialogue, is it now time for us to find our backbone in the Balkans and really make sure that we see the EU and the US shift, and that we get to a better and more fair place when it comes to Kosovo and its treatment?
But I think, first of all, on the sort of dossier, I mean, the only problem, just thinking about it, is, of course, it's always a question of what you can and can't publish. And if you don't publish everything, you're always going to be left with people saying, well, you haven't really told us all the extra stuff you might know that what was going on. So that might be the difficulty. But trying to, explain clearly what we think happened and could have happened, I think, is a worthwhile exercise. What I'd say about the British position is we didn't opt out of these dialogues. We, outside the EU, no, not yes. But I think, look, we should, as I've said, make the most of our new position of being friends, neighbours and partners of the EU and not members. And actually on this occasion it means that we should be clear about our own views and our own policy and our own approach. And I think, in line with what you're saying, we should show a frustration, a growing frustration with the attitude of the Serbian government. And of course, we haven't changed in our view that we want to give Serbia a chance of having a Euro-Atlantic disposition. We haven't changed in our view that if they should choose, they should be offered that future. But I think, I feel a sense of growing frustration that they're behaving in this way and doing these things. And we should be clear about that. As for why the EU and the US aren't, whether they're feeling that frustration, I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I sense from the conversations I've had that there is a frustration because they recognise that Bankska was a moment of great danger. One of the things I was struck by while there was that, sort of standing back from this, I would say that my sense is that the posture of the West when it comes to Kosovo and the Western Balkans more generally is sort of set in a time before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we need to think a lot about what's changed. Because, of course, Russia wants to do more to destabilize the Balkans, wants to do more through its proxies, including Serbia, wants to make this area and countries like Moldova less safe, and so we should be raising our game about what we can do to combat that. So I think our policy is, I would say, hard-headed, realistic. Lord Peach, Stu Peach, as you know him, my former CDS, went to Serbia, discussed all these matters with Vučić in a pretty frank way, and we should continue to do that. Our patience should wear rather thin.
I have to say it's an enormous relief to hear that, because that has not been, Britain has not displayed a muscular policy when it has come to this, even when Vučić again threatened British politicians. Serbia has been given a chance. Just very briefly before we move on, Serbia held its elections before Christmas. We had a vague tweet from the Minister for Europe saying there might be some concerns here. We then saw last week a leading Serbian politician kidnapped, beaten brutally because he went to lay flowers on the grave of an Albanian girl who was murdered by Serb forces. The brutality against him was really quite severe, and yet I've heard nothing from our Minister for Europe. What is your position on the current status of democracy in Serbia, and particularly that politician?
Well, first of all, we've called on for Serbia to investigate and act quickly on reports of serious election irregularities and to implement the recommendations of the OSCE and others. we share the concern of others about the way the elections were run. On the case of Nikola Sandelovic, we're aware of the reports. We've asked for more information. I mean, it does sound extremely concerning. And I want to be fully apprised of the facts of the case before reacting. But I'll take away that point.
I'll wait to hear. And I would say that the politician has said that the person who participated in his beating was the same man who led the terror attack against Kosovo, who then escaped to Serbia and still lives freely in Serbia.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Brendan.
Thank you, Chair. And can I just take us to the arbitrary detention of British nationals? And my first question would be, how will your approach differ to securing the release of UK nationals who are arbitrarily detained overseas? How will that be different from any of your predecessors?
Well, I'd sort of take a step back. I mean, I have a huge sort of concern about this issue, which is came originally, just so where I come from. When I was Prime Minister, of course, we had the sorts of problems you're referring to, but we also had the terrible terrorist hostage kidnaps. And it's the most heartbreaking thing you have to deal with as a Prime Minister when you've got British citizens taken hostage, brutally murdered in the desert, and families desperately wanting help. And so I know that's different to what you'd call state hostages, but it made me think a lot about how do we handle these issues, both in a way to make sure we're as effective as we possibly can be at getting people out of detention, getting people home, helping hostages, finding when terrorists have taken hostages and trying to get those hostages back. What's the best we can do, plus what is the best way of reassuring family members and others that the system is really working for them. And so this is a sort of long-winded answer, but where I've got to, because I've read your report, and we haven't sort of replied to it because I want to think about it more. And I think where I've got to, but I'd be very interested in your views, is that the advantage of the sort of American system of having a sort of outside person is, I think it is very reassuring. It's sort of reassuring to the families. There's this person, it's the hostage person, it's the prisoner person, that's good. But is it actually as effective as a really deep case-by-case analysis, working out in every case, using the whole of government, all the resources you've got, all the diplomats and all the expertise? And I think there's something between these two. I think when you look at our record, I don't think it's fair to say that we are sort of less good than other countries. I think when you look at all the cases of detention, including from the most well-known and famous all the way down to others, I think we've got quite a good record. So what I'm interested in discussing with officials, but I'd love your input, is there something which is sort of best of both worlds? We keep the case by case, keep the deep, thoughtful work on how to work each individual case, whether you want publicity, whether you don't, whether you want contacts, whether there are trade-offs, all these questions. But then having someone who is a sort of named person, possibly within the department, but possibly from assistance from outside the department, that that families know there's not just the minister that's dealing with this, there's this person inside the institution. So that's what I'm looking at, but I'm very interested in your views. Having said that, I mean, David Rutley, who's the minister who does this, he looks at these cases every month. He's incredibly diligent, and I want people to know that these cases get a huge amount of attention. But that's the way I'm thinking about it.
I suppose the obvious question then would be, do you think if you are the family of Ryan Cornelius or Jagtar Singh Johal, do you think that the current system is working well for them?
Yes, I do, in that if you take those cases, we look at them regularly, we meet with family members, we discuss them between ministers and officials. A huge amount of work goes into them. But could we do more to make the system a bit more visible and transparent to them in the way that I'm suggesting? Maybe that would help.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in the case of Jagtar, for example, the UN working group has said he has been arbitrarily detained. And I suppose the question is, why is the government not calling for his release while at the same time robustly asserting its right to provide him with ongoing consular assistance?
Well, we've looked at this case, and Philip's been dealing with it for longer than me, so he might want to speak to it. We've looked at this case and worked out that that is the right thing to do. And that's the right focus to have. But we're very happy to, and I'm happy to, meet with family members and explain why we've reached the conclusion we have. But that's the strength of the case by case. Is you've got to try and ask yourself what's the most important thing, whether it's consular access, whether it's calling on the Indian authorities to take this step or that step, or what have you. So that's what we do.
I know the families are very keen to meet you, and I'm delighted to what you said there. So it would be acceptable then to contact the families and arrange a meeting between yourself, or your department and the family of Jagtar.
I'll certainly have a look. I mean, I've got the list of some of the most complex cases with me. This one I've already discussed with officials, and I know that, as I said, Minister Rutley is the minister who deals with all of these important consular cases, because it's important to have one minister, but actually in this case Tariq Ahmed has also been very involved in this case, so I'm happy to have a look at it.
Sorry, can I pick up on that briefly?
Yeah.
Apologies. When we've had evidence in the past, David Rutley's consular minister has not looked after the cases. It has sat with the geographical minister, not with the consular minister, to the point that on the first day of Vladimir Kara-Murza's trial, when David Rutley appeared before us, he'd never heard of Vladimir Kara-Murza. So has it now shifted under your leadership?
Before I put my foot in it, Philip, do you want to explain?
There's been no change.
So what the policy described is every month David Rutley, as the Minister for Consular Affairs, sits down with Jennifer Anderson, who you know is Consular Director, and they look in the round at all the high-profile cases.
The cases technically sit
the individual
with the
cases go to the Geographical Minister, because they're in a sense best stable. So we're not describing a change in that regard.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
But my point is there might be an additional structural thing we put in place to try and get some of the best bits of the US system without getting what I think can be a disadvantage. Because what you don't want is ministers to go, oh, it's all dealt with by this other guy. So I'm trying to get the best of both worlds.
We look forward to discussing it more. Go on, please, Brendan.
Very briefly, one last question about the situation of Jimmy Lai.
Yeah.
I know that, I understand that you met with the family,
Yeah.
but did you consider, given that Mr. Lai is a UK national, is his detention a wrongful act against the UK, and why does the government accept China's position that the Vienna Convention does not apply to dual nationals?
Well, what we've said with this case is that we think China should repeal this law. This is a political trial, and they should release Jimmy Lai. On the issue of whether we refer to something specifically as arbitrary detention, there's a whole sort of complex set of legal arguments about whether you should or should not in each case do that. I'm very happy to write to you about it, because I don't want to mislead you in any way, but the most important thing is we're saying scrap the law, end the trial, release him. Thank you.
Perfect. Or did you want to come in briefly?
Yeah, just on the Jimmy Lai thing. I mean, and the Vladimir Kara-Murza thing. These are very, very basic sort of, very basic black and white, right and wrong. And the UK does seem to have a bit of a reputation of not kicking off enough in defence of its nationals, whether they're dual national or not. And Jimmy Lai has never been a Chinese citizen. We have a reputation for slightly soft peddling rather than kicking off in defence of our people who are political prisoners elsewhere in the world, Jimmy and Kara-Murza in particular.
I mean, I don't think that's fair, but I mean, I kind of know exactly. I mean, I used to worry about this a lot and always was kicking the tyres as Prime Minister. I'm doing that again as Foreign Secretary. I think the point is you've got to ask what actually works. And so my instinct is always sort of go in, size 10's blazing. We've got to make a fuss about this. We've got to do more. But then you've got to listen to the officials. And it might not change your mind, but it might, because it might be that there's some important ways that we think we might get this done if we make this argument rather than that argument. And so I just don't fall into. I mean, I think let's look at the facts and figures.
So fair enough. In what way has that helped either Jimmy Lai or Vladimir Kara-Murza?
Well, in those cases, we haven't yet met with success. I'm arguing, though, my argument, and I was talking actually to my predecessor about this morning, because I know he took it. If you look at the whole set of detained people and look at, does Britain do okay on this? I think the picture is a better one. But I totally, and I feel this is the Prime Minister who was PM when Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was originally taken. We've got to permanently kick the tires and ask ourselves, have we done the right thing? Have we raised the right arguments? Have we used the right level of publicity? Have we intervened at the right level? Have we intervened often enough? What works? These are the questions we've got to ask. But I'm a bit like you, but there's a danger of falling into the trap of just thinking if you shout and beat your fist, you get the results. I think there's always worth having that conversation with people who spend a lot of time thinking about it to work out what's best.
Ryan, please.
When you were Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, you and George Osborne and others, it wasn't a party political issue, had a very optimistic view of China's developing role in the world. I think it's fair to say that. It's no longer, I think, possible to sustain that optimistic view. How do you see the government's policy in regards to China developing as it becomes more aggressive and hostile?
I think, Graham, you put the question in exactly the right way, which is, a lot has changed. I think in 2010, the greatest priority for the government was to get the economy growing, to get investment into the country, to get our exporters exporting and all the rest of it. And there seemed to be an opportunity to have a better relationship with China, and we achieved that. And there were some good wins on trade and investment and what have you. But a lot has changed since then. We've had the situation with the Uyghurs, we've had the situation with Hong Kong, we've had the wolf warrior diplomacy. We've had a China that is a lot more assertive and aggressive in lots of different ways. I think where the government policy is, which I agree with and was keen to sign up and join the government on this basis, that we have the protect, the align, the engage strand, and every one of those is important. And I think we need to keep moving on all of them. Protect, things like the National Security Act, the National Security Investment Act, getting Huawei out of telecommunications equipment. That's important. There may be other things we need to do. The align, working with other partners in the G7 and elsewhere, many of whom at the moment actually have a more engaged relationship with China. Working with them to align, I think, is important. But the engaged bit is important. This is still a fifth of humanity. We're not going to solve climate change without talking with the Chinese. We're not going to try and work out the rules of the road on AI without at least engaging with the Chinese. So I think that's how the policy should go. And it's challenging because there are a lot of issues between us at the moment, but that's what diplomacy is all about.
Can I ask you a very specific question and then make a general point? You mentioned Hong Kong. Do you think those Chinese officials that are, generalising, repressing democracy, imprisoning pro-democracy activists and trade unions, do you think we should apply Maginski sanctions to them? And secondly, you very fairly say we need a tougher policy towards China. Do you think my impression of the department is it is still operating to the old policy rather than a new policy? And you mentioned Huawei. There was an enormous amount of resistance within the department to getting Huawei out of our system. When the Chinese consulate in Manchester beat Manchester citizens up on the streets of Manchester, there was a resistance from the department from taking official action. They let them quietly sneak out of the country. So I'd just be interested in your comments on that.
I'm going to defend my civil servants. I would say I'm not sure they ever fully adopted the George Osborne, David Cameron policy. So maybe you might find some consistency there. I think look, what matters is getting the right results, and the situation with regard to Manchester. I'm sure Philip would, before my time, would say, look, ultimately they're out of the country, and there wasn't a massive tit for tat with a whole bunch of British diplomats being sent home, so we got the result that was necessary. On Huawei, look, it was difficult because it was one of the few things that after leaving office I actually asked for a sort of proper briefing about, because the advice changed quite radically from about 20 2015, when I think I last was discussed it as Prime Minister, to 2017-18 when it happened. And so I wanted to understand what had changed, and perhaps we might need a more private setting to go through that. But I don't think there was any resistance in the Foreign Office. The situation had changed. What the Americans were doing had changed. That didn't necessarily mean we had to just follow the Americans because they're allies. It actually changed the nature of Huawei's business in Britain, if I can put it that way. So I would say the department is a lot of people who understand China very deeply, who want us to have a relationship that can bear a load and can deal with things like climate change and make sure that we have diplomatic relations. But there's no naivety. I don't sense any in the department naivety towards this. They know that China has changed in the last few years and become more assertive and more aggressive, and that's why the protect part of the policy is so important.
I'll try to get to the same point by asking a different question. You were very generous to your predecessor in your opening remarks. Can you name a single benefit that came from his recent trip to Beijing?
Yes, I can. In that, I think that his most importantly, I think his Mansion House speech was excellent. I mean, I think it really is a good speech on Britain's relationship with China and the difficulties and pitfalls and problems and how we should approach it. I think it's really good. And look, we have a situation in our relationship at the moment where, you know, we do need to have a relationship where we can discuss climate change, AI, trade matters about, you know, where we have a proper dialogue. The way to be able also to raise these cases, whether it's Jimmy Lai, whether it's other things, is to have a dialogue at a decent level.
I'm going to push you for a benefit because I need to bring in Brendan.
Okay, but so any benefit? Yes, I think things probably would be worse without it. That's a very Sir Humphrey answer. I'm applying for your job in a minute. But I mean, I think that's true. We've got all sorts of disputes, including about their embassy and our embassy. I mean, it would be much worse without it.
Please.
Do you agree with the Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee, who said in their China report last year that it is possible that David Cameron's role as Vice President of the £1 billion China-UK Investment Fund was in some part engineered by the Chinese to lend credibility to Chinese investment as well as to the broader China brand?
Well, I might if it had ever happened, but there was no fund, it never got going, it never started, and it never happened. So this is a bit like the blind man in the dark room looking for the black cat that isn't there.
You said right at the beginning that China is incredibly aggressive. Now, was that in reference to things like the partner countries in the Belt and Road Initiative who are unable to pay their loans, have their critical national infrastructure taken in lieu of payment? Is that what you were referring to about that aggression?
No, I think they're assertive in lots of different fora, whether it is what they in the South China Sea, or with respect to Taiwan, or in the dome of cyberspace, or what have you.
Yeah, but you have been a friend of China up until very, very recently, and you know, just weeks before becoming Foreign Secretary, you spoke at an investment event for Port City Colombo, whose main developer is owned by the state-owned company based in Beijing. Do you regret that now, particularly given that, as I understand it, that port is now in the hands of the Chinese government?
No, I mean, I did that. I mean, like many former prime ministers, I was worked with Washington Speakers Bureau, and this opportunity came up, and I did it as a friend of Sri Lanka. Actually, the Sri Lankan president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, when I was there on holiday, I met with him, and I went and had a look at Port Colombo, and his view was that this was something, having taken over from the Rajapaksas, the less said about the better, this was something he was keen to support and keen to make progress with. And so when this opportunity came up, I thought it was a sensible thing to do.
But that was only, 4 months ago, you know, shortly before taking this job, where you're now seen as being quite hawkish on China. But weeks before taking this job, you were actively promoting Chinese investment in Sri Lanka.
Actively promoting Sri Lanka. Right. So the British, as I understand it, our High Commission in Sri Lanka has facilitated British businesses to go and look at Port Colombo and have a look at whether they ought to invest in it. I mean, if you take a step back, what is Port Colombo about? Fundamentally, I think Dubai, with the DIFC, the Dubai International Financial Centre, did build a very effective way of attracting international businesses into a country, principally by having British law and British judges making judgments about land and building and title and the rule of law and all the rest of it. And many other countries, including Sri Lanka, are trying to copy this model. And my advice in the speech, hang on a second, 2 seconds. The speech I gave was that the more you can copy DIFC, the better off you will be. And that was
the
why
question
I did
isn't about the substance, the question is about your interest. And you said that you're doing it as a friend of Sri Lanka, but Sri Lanka's investment minister said the decision to have you speak was taken by the Chinese company. It wasn't a decision made by the Sri Lankan government.
Well, the decision to have me speak was a decision I made when asked via Washington Speakers Bureau, and the event was organised by an accountancy firm based in Sri Lanka.
Promoting the Belt and Road Initiative?
No, promoting this particular project at the request of the President of Sri Lanka.
Your words were the Belt and Road Initiative will bring new opportunities for bilateral cooperation.
I don't know where you're quoting that from. I mean, Belt and Road Initiative projects...
The 2018, after a dinner with President Xi Jinping, you released a statement that said that.
Well, you're now taking something from 2018 and
no,
applying
I know, but
it
the point stands in terms of your views.
Yeah. No. Well, I've explained exactly what I was doing, why I was doing it. I think these DIFC's type developments are a sensible thing, but the more countries can make them like the DIFC, the better they will be.
Henry, I'm sorry.
Go on, Brendan, go on. Do you regret doing it?
No.
Henry.
BGI is a Chinese state genomics firm that is harvesting information. It's used by the NHS, private medical providers in this country. The US has deemed it a military threat and has imposed restrictions on its activities in the United States. Do you think that the UK government should do likewise?
I would have to go away and look at it, and I should sort of declare an interest, which is after leaving office I did do some work with Illumina, which is the company that does genome sequencing, which is BGI's major competitor. So I don't want to give you a flip answer, but I remember when I was working with Illumina, they had a number of concerns about BGI, and I'm very happy to go away and have a look at it.
With apologies, colleagues, last question to Royston.
The Foreign Secretary, if everything's a priority, then nothing is. However, our priorities as a country ought to be where we can leverage the most influence, and that would be Yemen with the Houthis because of Iran, but similarly, Lebanon. What's our strategy on Lebanon? I mean, it's in an awful state. What is the UK strategy for Lebanon?
Our strategy in Lebanon is to work with the Americans and the French principally, because they have huge interests and expertise and commitments there. And our interest is to try and help Lebanon put together a functioning government. Our interest is to build up the Lebanese armed forces, who we spent a lot of money and time training. Our interest is in getting Hezbollah to move north of the Litani River. Our interest is to try and get the border properly demarked, and our interest is to try and get UNIFIL and Lebanese armed forces into the south of the country so that you can have some security, some stability, and the chance of there not being an escalation. Now, it's very easy to say all those things, but it's extremely hard to bring them about. But that in as much as there's a plan, that's the plan. Every plan needs to start with a single step, but that's what we're going to try and do.
Have we had a single step so far?
Yes, we have. I've met with the Lebanese Prime Minister twice. I've only been doing this job for a month, so I've met with him twice. I've had conversations about this with the French Foreign Minister, with the Secretary of State in America, and with others. It's obviously a time of very high tension in the south of Lebanon, so quite difficult to get these single steps, but starting to work out who will fund the Lebanese armed force expansion, who can contribute to UNIFIL, how do you bring Resolution 1701 back to life, how do you start taking these steps? A lot of work is being done on that right now.
Wonderful.
Brilliant. Foreign Secretary, thank you ever so much. We're in particular grateful for you undertaking to look again at our report on hostage taking, and we look forward to further sessions. I'm sure you'll be coming back to us once the Procedure Committee has reported, but we are very grateful to you both for taking the time.
Thank you.
Have a happy
Thanks very
New Year.
much.
Thank you.
Order.